Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I have a little announcement for you today, and I also wanted to make it sort of a topical video, not just announce something and then leave. So the announcement is my Saturn Returns course is back. I'm ready to offer my Saturn Returns course again for the third time ever. It's been 2 years since the last time, maybe not exactly 2 years, but the last time I offered the course was in 2017. I did not offer this course at all in 2018, and I did mean to start it a little bit earlier this year, but it is finally ready to go for the third time. So there will be a link in the description. You can check out all the information. Register by September 30th, and it's going to start October 5th. And because this is still a 4-month version of the course, it will be going into January of 2020, actually to the end of, so through January 2020. Capricorn is the sign that Saturn is currently in. It is my Saturn sign, and so if you were born under Saturn in Capricorn, whether you were born around the time that I was born, so you're around my age, or you are approximately 30 or 60 years older than me, if your Saturn is in Capricorn, we are going through our Saturn return right now. And I want to talk about a little bit about what that means, just in case you haven't seen my other videos on it or heard about it anywhere else. But I also just want to talk a little bit about some of the main concepts and themes that I see with Saturn Returns work that the course is definitely designed around. And one of the symbols specifically that is associated with Saturn that also has a little personal connection for me this year as well. So, Saturn Returns, if you don't know what it is, it's an astrological term that refers to the fact that the planet Saturn takes about 29.5 Earth years to make a full orbit of our solar system, of our sun, and return to the same place where it started. So wherever it is when you start counting, about 29.5 Earth years later, it returns to that same spot in its orbit. So it is said that when we are around 29 years old, we are experiencing our Saturn return because Saturn returns to the place in the zodiac where it was when we were born. So for me, my Saturn is in Capricorn, and so is yours if you were born right around the same time as me. A little bit of the end of 1988, all of 1989 and 1990, and a little bit into the beginning of 1991, Saturn was in the sign of Capricorn. It stays in each sign of the zodiac for a little over 2 years because its orbit is so long. So it's in each sign for quite a bit of time. So everyone born in 1989 or 1990, our Saturn sign is Capricorn. And then also anyone born approximately 30 years before that, or 29 years before that, and then 30 years before that, so 60-ish years before me, if you're about 30 or 60 years older than me, your Saturn sign is probably Capricorn as well. We are all going through our Saturn return. So that's what it refers to. It's about the length of Saturn's orbit and Saturn returning to the place it was when we were born. For us Saturn Capricorn people, Saturn returned to the sign of Capricorn, entered the sign of Capricorn this time around in December of 2017. And it remains in the sign of Capricorn until March 2020. So this iteration of my Saturn Returns course falls right into the end of the time that Saturn is in the sign of Capricorn this time around. And so if I offer the course again before that time, it will be a shorter, a 2-month sort of express version of the same course, but just a little bit less time in between the sessions. So just a little bit more express version of it. And we will do that in February and March of 2020, right as Saturn is leaving the sign of Capricorn to enter the next sign. So if your Saturn sign is Aquarius, it's entering your sign next, which means you're probably already feeling some of the effects of Saturn return type stuff. You might already be working with some of these concepts. So you can either join us this time around or wait for the express version at the beginning of 2020, or it doesn't matter if you are currently in your Saturn return now or not. You can definitely still join this course and learn some basic stuff about working with Saturn energy in general. I will talk about some things that are specific to Saturn in Capricorn type energy. Saturn also rules the sign of Capricorn, which is an earth sign, so we're talking about a lot of things that are Saturn's connections with Earth as a planet, as an element, those sort of magical associations that we have between those two things, and a little bit of specifics about Capricorn, because even if your Saturn is not in Capricorn, it is a sign that Saturn rules, so it's part of its sort of personality within astrology, if that makes sense. So the course is able to be taken by anyone at any time, whether you've already been through your Saturn return and you are still working with some of those concepts because maybe you didn't learn the lessons when it was happening, or you're still learning them and they came up during your Saturn return but you're still working through them, or if your Saturn return isn't for several years yet but you want to start learning about it in advance. It doesn't matter, you're welcome. So check out the link in the description again to read more about that and learn more about it. Basically, some of the big concepts of Saturn returns that are kind of the main themes for me, main things that I've been working with and therefore that I've put into the course, is Saturn ruling Capricorn and currently being in the sign of Capricorn. Capricorn has a lot to do with initiation and integration. By that I mean it has to do with sort of rites of passage of, we're moving from one stage of our lives into another, which even if you're not a fan of astrology, you might be very much aware of this, that people assign leaving your 20s and entering your 30s quite a big meaning in just our social lives for whatever reason. People kind of make a big deal about becoming 30. And it might be because of this Saturn energy without them really even knowing it. But also, there definitely is a lot going on for most people at this time in our lives as far as deciding what we want to do with our lives. Maybe we are finishing up college or deciding to go to college, or entering grad school, finishing up grad school, or not doing any of that, but starting a family, or transitioning from having started a family earlier and now our kids are a little bit older and now we're kind of like, what are we going to do next? There's so many things that at this time of life, so many people are still figuring out who we are and what we want to do. And then your second Saturn return in your late 50s into your early 60s, that's sort of considered another maturing point where people are kind of deciding, maybe they're retiring at that point, or maybe making a complete career shift, or, your family life has completely changed at that point, and so making decisions about where to go from there in that regard as well. And then the third Saturn return would come in our late 80s, early 90s, and that is very much moving into, if you're not already considered, moving into a state of being an elder. And so they're each sort of different levels of maturing into whatever the next stage of life is for us at the time. So for me, the idea of initiation has to do with that sort of rite of passage and being initiated by Saturn, or just through working with Saturn, by ourselves, by our lives, by the universe, into whatever the next stage of our path is. And for me, it's about taking things more seriously and actively stepping into certain roles that maybe I've already been thinking about and kind of working toward for several years, but this period of time is really okay, you got to make that decision now kind of thing. And are you going to do this or not? You're going to do this for real, you got to do it for real kind of thing. So that's sort of how the initiation part of it feels to me. The integration aspect has to do with integrating our ideas, our desires, our spiritual endeavors, whatever, into our physical life, into our everyday life, we might say our mundane life. And this is a little bit of the earth connection, that the goals that we plan for ourselves, the limitations and boundaries that we set for ourselves, or that have been set for us by others, are now being examined, and we are making decisions about whether we truly want to integrate those things into our physical lives, our everyday lives, or if we are realizing that that's not my goal for myself, that was someone else's goal or expectation for me, and now at this threshold, I am deciding to leave that behind and move on into this new phase of my life as myself, of who I have determined myself to be at this point. So yeah, the integration aspect is a big theme for me that we'll talk about a lot throughout the course, just as well as you've probably already heard me talk about on my channel, because it's something that has really stuck with me through this work since I started working on this type of thing years ago. Really making the mental and spiritual aspects, grounding them into the physical reality, making them a reality, you know. So yeah, those are some of the big themes for me, as well as limitations and boundaries are a big association with Saturn, because in medieval astronomy, Saturn was the furthest planet that we knew existed. The planets beyond Saturn were not discovered yet, could not be seen at the time, and so Saturn became associated with outer limits and boundaries and endings of cycles, death, things like this, which, if you're familiar with tarot or any other similar sort of symbolism, we know that death is also a symbolic of transformation, ending of cycles, things like that. So all of those types of things are big themes for me with Saturn energy in general. And then with the Saturn returns, it's kind of just our opportunity to work with that in such a way that moving forward, we can make things a little bit easier, because Saturn is also thought of as pretty negative throughout astrology. I keep confusing astronomy and astrology, like which one am I about to say? Throughout astrology's past, Saturn has been known as the greater malefic, Mars being the lesser malefic, meaning that they were thought to have more negative influences on us. If they had really strong influences in our birth chart, it was thought to mean certain things would be more difficult for us, certain things would maybe be strained or challenged or limited, restricted, blocked, things like this. So people think of Saturn energy as being a pretty bad time, and I would like to change that for everyone. So there are a lot of astrologers now, lots of great resources online that you can access for free as well that will talk about this, that Saturn is not such a bad thing, and it doesn't have to be thought of in that doom and gloom sort of way. It's actually fantastic opportunities to work with these things and examine our boundaries and limitations, our expectations, our goals, and release what no longer serves, which is a big popular thing right now and a very popular phrase right now, something that I think is very important. We can do all these things, release the things that no longer serve, examine what we really want out of our lives, and move forward. And yes, there are things within this that might be really difficult, but it's for the better. It's really easy to say. So I'll give you an example. The kind of things that I've been dealing with since I feel like my Saturn returns energy started. I have only just now turned 29 this year, and Saturn is moving out of the realm of Capricorn, and that's because when I was born was closer to the end of Saturn being in the sign of Capricorn at the time. If you were born a couple years earlier than me, like right at the beginning of Saturn entering Capricorn, then you are probably a person who was 29 in December of 2017 when Saturn entered Capricorn this time around, you know. I was 27 at that point. So we're just born at different phases of this a little over 2-year span of time that Saturn was in Capricorn when we were being born. But, excuse me. So, if you were someone who was 29 at that point, you might have started feeling the effects of Saturn returns this time around when you were 27. I was 27 when it entered the sign of Capricorn this time. I started feeling the kinds of energy that I associate with Saturn and being pushed to make the kinds of changes and examine the kinds of things in my life that I associate with Saturn starting when I was 25. So depending on when you were born throughout the time that Saturn was in your sign, you might have been feeling this energy already for quite a while. So for me, it started when I was about 25, 26, and some of the first things that I was being guided and feeling called to do, some changes that I was feeling called to make, included, first and foremost, heavily re-examining a long-term relationship that I was in at the time. And it wasn't until a couple years later, when I was starting to do my research for this Saturn Returns work and offering this as a course for other people to do along with me, that I bothered to look up such things in my birth chart as the houses, which are not something that I was ever really super concerned with before. I feel like that's like the next step of astrology beyond like knowing your sun sign and your moon sign and maybe your rising sign. Those are kind of like more basic. And then learning about the other signs and the houses is kind of like the next step. So it wasn't until later that I learned that my Saturn in my birth chart is actually in my 7th house, which is the house concerned with relationships, partnerships, marriages, things like that. So it makes perfect sense that Saturn return for me would have a lot to do with re-examining that aspect of my life, re-examining partnerships, relationships, and for me it was also re-examining the entire concept of what does love mean? What does it mean to be in a loving relationship with someone? How do we show that? How do we show love to other people in general, not romantically, but in other sorts of partnerships, friendships, business associations, any kind of partnership, not always romantic, right? So these are a lot of things that I was starting to examine at 25 and 26. And then the next big thing for me after re-examining that long-term relationship, which by the way ended as a result of said examination, the next big thing for me was quitting a full-time job that I had for multiple years, because re-examining that and re-examining my relationship with it and my relationship with the people for whom I worked, all of this also led me to realize that both the romantic partnership and the business partnership, my job at the time, neither were really supporting who I felt I was trying to become, you know, and who I was meant to be and what I was supposed to be doing. And so those are two big things that got shaken up for me before Saturn even entered the sign of Capricorn. So by the time Saturn entered Capricorn, I had kind of those two big things checked off the list, you know, done, but I was still very much dealing with the aftermath of them and coming to terms with what does making those decisions mean for me now. how do I move on from this? What do I do next? What do I do instead? What do I focus my time on? You know, what do I now have the opportunity to do because I made those difficult choices? So that's kind of where I was coming into 2018 after Saturn entered Capricorn at the end of 2017. I didn't offer this course again in 2018. 2018 was a lot for me, as have all of these last few years been, really. And now I'm still very much working on some of the same stuff, but I am in a very stable relationship now. We have moved. I am in a completely new place. Again, I've moved twice since then. I've gone through a couple different transitions with, you know, how am I going to make what I'm doing in the world work for me? How am I going to bring that into physical integration? You know, not just saying what I'm doing and who I am, but how do I actually be that? And that goes back to the sort of things that I was being challenged with, the messages that I was getting from the universe back in 2015, to speak my truth and live my truth. And so you might remember videos that I did on this channel at that time talking about those different shifts that I was experiencing and the overall messages to speak my truth and live my truth, be my truth. And I was like, what the hell does that mean? Ever since then, I've been kind of being constantly challenged to figure out what does that mean and how do I integrate that into my life. Once I figure out what that means, how do I make it be real, more real, I guess, more physical, if that makes sense. And all of these things I see as being huge aspects of Saturn Returns energy. So this all combines for me. The last thing I wanted to share, I said I wanted to talk about a specific symbol. As I was rereading some of my notes on my previous Saturn Returns courses in preparation to make this video for you, I was trying to think, like, what should I talk about? Because I've talked about what Saturn Returns is before. I've done a little video about Saturn in the houses. I could probably redo that video and make it a lot better, but I didn't want to do that this time around because I felt like, I've done it. What should I make the video about this time? So obviously I decided on a little bit of an update and like major themes and how they've applied to me so far going through my Saturn return. But I also came across this other thing that I just thought was kind of cool. So I want to share this just as a little add-on, that one of the various symbols of Saturn in mythology, Saturn being a Roman name of a deity, the Greek version, the Greek name of this similar archetype being Kronos, or we might think of them also as Father Time, things like that. If you're a fan of Sailor Moon, you might think of Sailor Saturn, and many other iterations, many other faces of Saturn representations certainly exist. But one of the other symbols of Saturn is as the Hermit from the Tarot, from the major arcana of Tarot. And I had forgotten that the Hermit was an association of Saturn until I was rereading my notes the other day. And I just thought that was so funny because the Hermit is my tarot card for 2019. So based on when I was born, my birth date combined with this current year is how I get my year card for this year. Just so happens that mine this year is the Hermit, and the Hermit is also a Saturn symbol. So that just was kind of a fun little bit of synchronicity for me as I was deciding, like, okay, we're gonna launch the third version of this course. I'm finally ready to get back to it. I want to do a video about it. What should I talk about? You know, open up my notes and I see the Hermit. I'm like, yep. And it's been a Hermit year for me, for sure. The Hermit to me is so much about taking the time in solitude to study and learn and, you know, really examine our inner lives and what's going on with us, which is so much of the Saturn energy, so much of the Saturn work that I've been doing as well. but the hermit is also about then taking that knowledge that we have accrued through our solitary study and inner work and inner examination and re-examination, and taking that and then becoming the teacher, bringing that to other people, to the world. And that's the light in the lantern that the hermit is carrying. Is, you know, we think of the hermit as being very alone, not necessarily lonely, but as working alone. And colloquially speaking, we use like being a hermit to mean like you're just shut up by yourself and you're not being social or whatever. But it's very important to remember that the hermit does that because that's just sometimes a necessary way to take time for ourselves to learn about ourselves. But ultimately, it's to then bring that light to the world and guide others, which I feel is something that I'm doing through this course as well, and is kind of the reason that I made it into a course, because I figure I'm the kind of person who loves to do all of this different types of research and find all these different sources and ideas about Saturn, and then bringing my own work as a witch and as a priestess into creating ritual for us to do together around this energy, creating spells, or talking about the types of spells that we can do and the way that we can really invite Saturn specifically into that magic. And then not just doing it for myself, by myself, in my little hermit study, but bringing that to the world and offering that to other people to do this work with me, to do this work together in a small group. So yeah, that's kind of where this came from. And I'm really excited to do this again. As I mentioned, this is definitely work that I've obviously been doing for a couple of years, but it is still very much something that I am currently working on and working with. It's not something that I've completed and checked off the list, even though maybe I have completed some steps in the process. I am by no means done with this work. Saturn is still in Capricorn until March of 2020, and then some people say that this is only the work beginning, and it's going to stick with us for another phase yet as Saturn enters into the next sign and some other people start their Saturn return. We are still doing the work, and I very much agree with that, because so far I would never try to say that, you know, like, oh yeah, by next year I'm going to be done with this. I would never dare to think that, because no way. This is ongoing work, but the course only lasts 4 months, and then after that we will remain in contact and we can still talk about the work that we have done through the course. But yeah, the course itself is only 4 months long, so relatively not that long. Thanks so much for watching. Please do check out the link to learn more about my Saturn Returns course. It'll be in the description below. And let me know, are you going through your Saturn return? Did you already go through one or more than one? Are you about to go into yours? Have you never heard of this before, ever? Share whatever you'd like that seems relevant to the topic in the comments, and I will see you next time. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye. Thanks for watching and listening.